Hey everybody, and welcome to Bright Founders Talk at Tami. Tami is an international software development company that designs, builds, and delivers software for sustainable businesses and promising startups. Welcome to our podcast, where we bring you the most inspiring stories of entrepreneurs and experts in the software development industry. Each week, we interview successful leaders who share their unique journeys and valuable insight. And today, our guest speaker is Harry Holmwood, who is co-founder and CEO at Magic Cave. Hello, Harry. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. I'm very good, thank you. Nice to be talking to you.
It's a pleasure for us as well to have you today at our studio, we can say. So it's obvious that we are here to talk about your company, about your entrepreneurial journey, and I want to start from some kind of creative question, I believe, for you and for our audience. It will be regarding maybe your hobby. So if you were to write a book about your journey as a CEO and co-founder, what would the title be, and what the most important lesson or message you would want to tell with this book?
That's a good question. I think something along the lines of how to be lucky, or you're nothing special, right? I think people sometimes over celebrate the role of the CEO or the entrepreneur, and the reality is that in all companies the work is done by other people, and certainly there certainly are people that run companies or build companies that are very like led from the top, that are someone's got a very certain vision and they want to make it happen, and maybe you'd say someone like Elon Musk is like that or whatever, but certainly for me it's much more about the other people, and I see that the company founder or CEO's role is really just there to facilitate other people. You find clever people that want to do stuff, and you give them the flexibility and the tools and the environment to do that. So yeah, and as a result of that, I think a book called How to Be Lucky kind of works, right? It's what I've found over the years is there is an awful lot of luck, whether it's because you were born in the right place, or you went to the right school, or you just found yourself in a situation where everything went right. And video games is a difficult business, and most of the time it doesn't go right, but sometimes it does. And so it's that combination of luck, but you can also make yourself be a little bit more lucky, right? It's a little bit like maybe you can't always win the lottery, but you certainly don't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. So a combination of doing stuff, not thinking you're anything special. It's the people that you're working with that make the magic happen. But maybe you're playing a role in just getting the right people together and sort of setting them free to do cool stuff. That's what I think I've done over the years.
We will definitely discuss all of the challenges and difficulties which you are facing in video gaming industry, but continuing this topic, you thought regarding to be lucky, and what is about entrepreneurial instinct? Do you believe that people can be born with it, or you just need to be taught with this instinct, let's say?
I think maybe it's a bit of both. I think some people are very good at focusing in on one thing, and so I was a games programmer and still occasionally am, but I fairly quickly became aware an awful lot of other people were much better at it than I was. They were more technically minded, they were better at getting into the detail, but what I found I was pretty good at doing was being able to sort of speak everyone's language, so I could understand a little bit about the programming. I could understand a little bit about the design, a little bit about the finance. And maybe it's that kind of person that is quite good at founding companies. People that, their minds maybe jump from thing to thing, and they don't become brilliant at anything. There are much better programmers in my company than I am. There are much better designers than I am. There are much better money people than I am. But maybe I've just got a little bit of all of those things, and it maybe just comes of getting bored quickly and wanting to always find a new thing. I think maybe those are the kind of people that are quite good at starting companies, or are forced to start companies because they can't do anything else.
Yeah, that's definitely true, because as an entrepreneur, I believe you need to wear a lot of hats and play different roles. So as you said, to be a designer, to be a finance guy, and so on. Let's move to your company, to our main topic of our conversation, to Magic Cave. So your company, your team, you are aiming to build community-driven virtual toys, games, and hobbies. Can you share with us the story behind the founding of Magic Cave, and how actually you came up with the idea of creating this fantasy hobby ecosystem?
Sure. So I mean, it's a strange way that the company started, really, in that there are three of us that started the company: myself, our CTO Ed, and our creative director Steve. And Ed I'd worked with before. I used to co-founded a company called The Secret Police. We made mobile games, including Stardew Valley was one of the best known thing that we worked on mobile. And Ed then worked somewhere else, but our paths crossed again. Ed got in touch with me and was interested in starting his own company. He hadn't had his own company before, and we were chatting about that. At the same time, Steve, who is a game designer that I've known for maybe 20 years, we'd never worked together, but we knew each other pretty well, and had always wondered if we could do something together. Steve and I had been talking about doing something, and we actually started writing a puzzle game together. Kind of more, Steve had this great idea for a puzzle game, and I was just kind of wondering what to do next, and it was a nice project, and we started doing that, and we made a prototype of this puzzle game. But at the same time, the hobbies thing is something I've always been interested in since I was a boy. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons and games like that as a kid, and I always liked the fact that hobbies like that, or like Warhammer, or they sometimes offer different things to different people. So when I was 10 or 11 and played D&D, some people, I really like painting the miniature figures, for example. And I also was kind of geeky enough that I at the time my brain remembered facts really well, right? So I could remember all of the stats of the different characters, and all the magic spell. I really liked knowing all of that stuff, and kind of almost like photographically memorizing the books. But my best friend, he was the dungeon master, and he liked to create the worlds and create the stories, and other people were just more into the playing it or the social side of it. And there was really all different facets of this hobby, and it doesn't just apply to things like D&D. It applies to almost anything that sort of people do as a hobby. People might be into cars, and some people are just into owning a fancy car. Some people like building cars or restoring cars. Some people like modifying cars. Some people like racing cars. And again, they're different parts of hobbies that bring people with slightly different interests together. And I really like that. And I think the internet is great at that, because it can bring people together from all over the world. And so that's something that's been in the back of my mind for 20 years or so. I gave a talk on it maybe 10 years ago at a conference called Game Horizon, sort of looking at Dungeons and Dragons as in a way, a really good early example of a free-to-play game, in that you didn't have to buy anything to play that game. You could just, have a set of dice and have some ideas in your head and play that game with your friends, but you could also go out and buy, you could buy the figures, you could buy the paints to paint the figures, you could buy the dice, you could buy the dungeons, and all of these different things made that into not just a great hobby, but a great business. And so that's been in my mind for a long time. And at the time that we founded Magic Cave, we were looking for something to do, and blockchain was very much sort of everyone was talking about blockchain, and all three of us had been fairly skeptical about blockchain and its use in games. And I think there'd been, a lot of projects, not just in games, but across the Web3. It wasn't really called Web3 back then, but across that space, people issuing cryptocurrency tokens that maybe rocketed up in value and made some people rich, but then came down in value. And we were kind of looking at it thinking, well, a lot of these things seem to be about creating the illusion of value somewhere. And we didn't think that was very interesting, and it felt like that was going to come to an end. But at the same time, we did think there was something very interesting about this idea of provable ownership of something digital. I've been involved in games for 30 years now, and it was maybe it's probably about more than 20 years ago, was interested in the idea of kind of digital collectibles. I remember having a conversation, it would have been about 99 or 2000. It was around the time that Beanie Babies had become this collectible thing. And I've been interested in again, it's like one aspect of hobbies is people collecting things, whether it's stamps, or things that retain their value like those, or things that kind of were a passing fad like Beanie Babies. And subsequently we've seen things like Magic the Gathering cards. And I find that really interesting. Some people just really like the concept of collecting things and curating their own sets. And it means a lot to them personally, and it helps people to get invested into a hobby for some people. So, we thought that was really interesting. So we started thinking, okay, well, there is something about this ownership that sounds interesting to us, but at the same time, it's a very scammy space. There's a lot of bad actors in that space. And we just kind of thought, well, what about if you did something with blockchain and it wasn't a scam? How would you do that, right? How would you, what is it you do to try and make the experience as for players better? And what might it mean to us as game designers? What are the tools that it might give us that we didn't have before? And one of the things that Steve became very interested in was just the idea that you can take an object, whether it's taking it from one game into another, which in Web3 and games, people talk a lot about interoperability of assets. And there's, some of that I think is a little bit unrealistic. But just the idea that you can take something from one place and put it in another, that might even just be on a third-party marketplace and you can sell it. But that makes that thing feel a little bit more real to the player. And this idea that things feel real is really important, I think, that, as the world becomes more virtual, the things that matter to people, they're often things that are somehow beautiful items, right? Whether it's people like beautiful handcrafted watches, or people like jewelry, or virtual examples of this would be things like, I don't know if you've played a game called The Room. It's a very successful iPad and iPhone game where the developer has made these sort of puzzle boxes, virtual puzzle boxes with beautiful dials on them, and you open them up and there are puzzles to solve. And one of the things that I think is magical about that game is that those things feel nice to touch. And even though they're digital, they're not really there. They somehow feel tactile and they feel real. And it reminded me a bit of going back probably 25 years to when I first played a demo. It might even have been when I worked at Sony, I can't remember, but I played a demo of Tony Hawk's skateboarding on the PlayStation 1. And there was something about the feel of it that just it felt so right. I was just controlling a character on a skateboard with a joystick, but there was something about it that felt so right that it just made me feel at ease with the process. And I felt like I was skateboarding, even though I've never stood on a skateboard in my life, or if I did, I know I'd fall off. And when you get that feeling right, a lot of other things fall into place. So this idea kind of started to grow of how do we make things feel real? And this idea of ownership is one part of that. But things like if you're playing a racing game, as game designers, we're all about tricking people in a way into thinking things are happening that aren't happening. So if you're playing a racing game and your car moves towards the side of the track onto the rough ground, we might shake the screen, to make it feel like you're doing that, or shake the controller. None of those, those things are not real. They just pretend to make it feel real. And we felt that this idea of ownership and moving things from one place to the other might also reinforce that. So that's kind of where it started. And we started thinking, okay, well, what's the simplest thing we can do? Because we know nothing about blockchain. We know about games. And Steve came up with just this idea, well, the simplest thing we can do is probably dice. We can make dice, and beautiful kind of collectible, tactile, digital dice made out of different materials, containing different things. And from there, we started thinking, okay, well, dice is this wonderful starting point for things that people might want to collect. And then how do we build a hobby around those that's different from what anyone's done before? So then we started thinking, okay, well, these dice, they all had characteristics. As we were designing them, some of them look very magical, some of them look very aggressive. And we thought, okay, well, we can take those dice and use them to create characters, and you can play those characters in the game. So if we came up with this idea that you drag these dice into a character creator, and if you drag a load of magical dice into the character creator, it'll make you some kind of magical character. If you drag some warrior dice instead, then it's going to be a warrior, and you can mix them together. So you're basically combining all these different dice to make characters that look different and play different, have different skills. And that was kind of the foundation on which we started to build what's called Dino, or D number, which is this hobby. And the idea is that around that, there are the sort of the core is the dice and the characters, and then the worlds that these things exist in, and then building games inside those worlds with those characters, with those dice, and also allowing other people eventually to build those. So as well as building games ourselves, we're going to be putting out SDKs that allow other creators to do that. And it's something we've seen a little bit already in games. I mentioned we worked on the mobile version of a game called Stardew Valley, which was a very successful PC game. And one of the things I think that really helped that game to shine was the fact that it had a really strong modding scene. So the guy that built the original game, Eric, was very open to allowing other people to come in and bring their creativity to it and change the game and change the graphics and allow them to sort of take it in their own direction. And then maybe a game like Minecraft kind of takes that idea and takes it even further. But we think you can go further still and allow, effectively, eventually sort of hand the whole hobby over to a community and say, you know, this is ours, and there's ways that we make money within this ecosystem, but you guys can do whatever you want with it. You can build your own games, you can build your own worlds, you can own your own worlds, you can own, you might just want to own the dice, but and it's a little bit like, maybe like Lego, right? So when you buy a Lego set, some people just want to build the star, you know, the Star Wars spaceship that's on the box, and they're very happy with that. But other people want to take it apart, build something that's completely new and their own. And I think that's one of the reasons why Lego is great, because it's up to you, right? You can get as deep into that hobby as you want, or you can just do, you know, the fun stuff that the original designers thought was what you should do, you know.
So we can say you've created not only like the hobby ecosystem, but also you've give the opportunity to people to create it by themselves. Yes.
That's right. Yeah, that's the goal. I mean, we're at an early stage of it. The first stage is for us to you know, build our first games and release those, and at the same time, you know, allow other people to do it. But these things it's going to take a lot of time, and we'll need to build a community around that. We're right at the beginning of that journey at the moment.
It's really captivating that you give such an opportunity to people, because your story is about that you've managed to create your hobby from childhood, your passion to your job, and so you are, I believe, not working a day in your life because you've made it. And so you even try to make these for other people, and it's really nice and captivating story. So you are really profound in gaming. How, and it's not a secret that you were one of the guys who launched in the end of the last century PlayStation. If I'm not mistaken, I found those facts on your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah. It was my second job in the industry. And it's hard to think now, but at the time, Sony, when we launched the first PlayStation, we were pretty small. You know, we were quite a small team. And yeah, I mean, it was an amazing time, an amazing place to be. Obviously, it went really well, and Sony went from and we went very quickly from being the kind of strange people in a small office, which was part of Sony Music, to suddenly PlayStation being this huge success. But yeah, it's
yeah. And how has your experience as a part of Sony's team that launched PlayStation shaped your approach to building and scaling a game studio like Magic 8?
I think well, what Sony did, and whether it was by accident or design, I don't know, but they hired, you know, a lot of the people that were working there had never worked in games before. So I think I'd only been working in games for 2 years when I joined, but I was one of the more experienced people at the time. So, a lot of people were straight out of university. But I think what Sony did was just there were a handful of what I would call grown-ups, so some older people with some more experience than we had. But by and large, people were left to figure out what to do. There wasn't a lot of top-down strategy at the time. So what seemed to happen is that people just saw that something needed to be done. And maybe I think Sony did a good job of hiring the right kind of people, but people saw something needed to be done, and so they did it. So, many examples of this, but, I can remember, I went into the office once and some people had turned up from a publishing company and they needed to put a demo disc onto their magazine. And we realized that no one had sorted out how to do this. I think that it just had somehow slipped everyone's attention that this magazine was supposed to have a disc on the front. And so a colleague of mine, stepped in, and we had a meeting with these guys, and we solved the problem, and we put together a demo disc, and the magazine went on to be the most successful magazine in Europe, as far as I remember. Not just Video Games Magazine, the most successful magazine in Europe. But that's just an example. It was a little bit chaotic, but when people saw that something needed to be done, everyone really cared. I think also we did have the coolest piece of technology. The PlayStation 1 at the time. I mean, it's obviously very old now, but when we saw the first technology demos for that coming out of Japan, it was pretty jaw-dropping. It was such a big advance on. So I think everyone was really excited. Everyone wanted to make it work. There were lots of things in our favor, but then there were also, just enthusiastic people trying stuff out. Another example would be on the marketing side. Before PlayStation, most games marketing had been targeted at teenage boys. It was kind of 13, 14 years old. That was seen as the games market, but Sony wanted to make it broader than that. And I remember a guy called Jeff Glendenning, who was the head of PR. Again, he was only in his mid-20s at the time. But he had this idea that you could put PlayStations into nightclubs, which no one had done before. No one had made that association that maybe games could be cool. Maybe games weren't just for teenage boys. And that was tremendously successful. And things like getting, really cool graphic designers involved in, the design of the packaging, and, famous musicians making the music for games. All of that stuff was pretty new, and I think Sony just gave everybody the flexibility to do that, which was amazing. And that's kind of stuck with me ever since. And I always try to step back and not dictate too much. This is what we need to do, and this is how you need to do it. I think it's much better to, if you can, let people find out those things for themselves, because the chances are, they'll have much better ideas than I will. And it's kind of the same with this idea of expanding hobbies out into the community. Our team is only 15 people at the moment, but that's 15 times more people having ideas than just me. But if we had 1 million people thinking about that hobby in a community, then of course you're going to get amazing ideas and amazing creativity coming out of that.
And so, as we talked regarding that you give this opportunity to people to create everything by themselves, was it hard to find this product market fit? And maybe you are only in the stage of finding it.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, we don't know yet if we're going to have product market fit. I think what we are trying to do is to develop it as publicly as we can. So if anyone wants to see what we're doing, you can come to our Discord, join our Discord. We are regularly kind of putting updates on there, and when we look, we'll within the next 2 or 3 months we'll launch just a test version of a very small part of our first game, just because we want to see what people think of it, how do people play it, but we want to be questioning our assumptions all the time. So if anyone wants to come to magiccave.io, there is a link to our Discord, so people can check that out. But I mean, I think it's very likely that a lot of the things we think at the moment are going to end up being wrong. So, I think a big part of the process is being agile and being able to change that. And I found over the years, kind of going back to what I said at the beginning about how to be lucky, an awful lot of times the projects that I've put the most time and effort trying to make work haven't worked. But what has happened is maybe being in the space, meeting people, or being exposed to technologies or whatever it is, that those failed projects have facilitated, have led to something else. So I would say most of the most successful things I've done have come as a result of something else not working. So I think you've got to be flexible, and with games, and I'm sure it's the same with other businesses. Sometimes just being in the business, eventually some magic happens that you weren't expecting, and if you're able to pick up on those opportunities when they do arise, that's when something amazing can happen. And I've found if a project is going to go well, quite often it just suddenly gets amazing momentum. And something that you've been trying, whether it's to raise money or to get product market fit on something, and it just hasn't been happening, eventually you've got to say, you know what, this isn't working. But suddenly something else will happen and it will just explode, and things will move really fast. That's when you know that something has got real potential.
I believe that it's one of the lessons which you learned during your entrepreneurial story path. And what another lesson you've learned, and what was the way of solving this lesson? How did impact this lesson you and your approach to launching your company?
I think maybe an example of this would be, in my previous company, the Secret Police, which I founded with a friend. We were founded to make free-to-play mobile games, and we had a great team, built a really good free-to-play mobile game. But however hard we were trying, we just couldn't make that game make any money. But the fact that game existed, the fact that it was really polished, it was beautiful, it was fun, wasn't making money, but that led to us having good relationships with lots of people in the mobile games industry, from Apple and Google and people like that, but also just having a product that showed we could build a really good mobile game. And I think without that, we would never have got the contract to make Stardew Valley Mobile, which went on and still is, in fact, one of the most successful premium mobile games out there, I believe. We're not involved in it anymore, but I believe it still tends to be in the top 5 or top 10 best-selling games on mobile, and it's been out for 4 years, I think. So those things happen because something else. You were just interfacing with people, learning skills, learning how business areas of a business work. Doors get opened all the time.
And what was the biggest challenge for you as for entrepreneur in video game industry?
I think that now, it's changed so much. So when I started my first company, which was 1996. Game industry was much smaller, and really the process of making a game was usually that you'd have a relatively small game development studio. A bigger company like Electronic Arts or Activision would fund that studio to make a game, and that company would have relationships with the retailers and the distributors, and because the games were all coming on discs, there was no online distribution, and that kind of thing meant that there weren't very many games coming to market, because it was difficult. So once you were in the circle, once you were in the industry, it was if you were pretty good at what you did, it was possible to have a business and to make money. But if you look now, everybody can release a game. Anybody can write a game. The tools, the engine technology that's available to everybody for free is incredible, and the distribution to every customer in the world on mobile, access to billions of customers, is available to everybody for free. So that means there's just a lot of games out there. So I think now the big problem is, how do you make something that's going to stand out? It's a very big problem, I think. Not just in games, but in entertainment generally. I think in music, I read some crazy figure the other day that said every day there's 100,000 new tracks uploaded to Spotify, which is incredible, right? You'll never listen to 100,000 tracks in your life. And that's happening every day. And games is not, it's not that kind of number, but there are more games that exist than you could ever play if you live for 1,000 years, I suspect. So I think increasingly coming down to, okay, how do you make the best game, or how do you identify what is the audience you're making this game for? Maybe you can't compete with a $200 million game from Activision, but maybe you can make a game that has an audience of a few thousand people, but if they love it and it becomes a hobby for them and they become passionate about it, then maybe you can build a sustainable business around that. So it's about identifying who your audience is.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, is it the, let's say, competition, who is better, who is best? And what do you believe is the measurement factor for this, who is best? Is it the plot of the game? Is it the visual effects? What it can be?
I think it could be, I don't think it's any specific thing. I think it's sometimes the magic happens. So some of the most successful games in the world don't have fancy visual effects. Stardew Valley is a great example, or Minecraft. If you look at Minecraft, it's a very basic looking game. And sometimes people will, big companies might spend tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars making a game, but it's no fun. So sometimes all of those aspects just have to be right for someone. And the good thing is, I think now, whereas when I started doing this, the audience was pretty small. I think the PlayStation 1 was very, very successful. I think we sold something like 100 million PlayStation 1s. But now there are billions of people playing games. So the potential audience is that much bigger. So it's possible to segment that audience. You don't necessarily have to sell. If you've got a small team that is lean and able to be cost effective, maybe you shouldn't spend loads of money building huge worlds or having the fanciest visual effects. Maybe you need but being small forces you to focus in on what is actually going to be important for your particular customers, which might be something about the gameplay. It might be the story. It might be that it's a multiplayer game with really great balance or whatever. But I think the key is you can't do everything. You can't make a game that's going to appeal to everybody anymore, unless you're spending $1 billion on it.
And that's definitely true. And even in just day-to-day life, you can't be liked with anyone. And so what upcoming trends you are seeing that they are coming in the gaming industry?
Obviously, the thing everyone's talking about for the last few months is AI, which I think is really interesting. We think that to an extent there's been a bit of a jump from everyone talking about blockchain 2 years ago to everyone talking about AI now, and I think in both cases there's people AI is interesting because it can be so visually impressive. When someone first sees it, whether it's a ChatGPT demo or Mid-Journey or something like that, it's jaw-dropping when if you haven't seen the generation of perfectly written text or photographic imagery. It is an astonishing thing to see. So I think that has kind of fed into everyone's excitement about that. I think always the tech industry is looking for the next big thing, and investors are looking for the next big thing to invest in. But I think the use of AI technology in games is definitely going to be important. I think it's probably, certainly at the moment, it's what we found is when you dig deeper into it, some of it is a lot less usable than you would hope, but that doesn't mean it's not usable. And I think it's so much of this stuff is in its infancy, but we're already making use of whether it's using generative AI to make textures that we might apply to dice or characters. Our worlds and our characters and our dice are all procedurally generated. So most of what we're doing there is not using machine learning, but there's little bits of it. But one of the things that we're interested in as well is, as well as players owning their own dice and their own characters, they can also own a whole world, so that we generate these worlds that they play in procedurally. And we're working now on technology that will create the whole lore, the stories within those worlds and the stories of the characters that exist in those worlds. And we're using generative AI for those. We're also using AI for in-game narration, so voices that are telling those stories as you play. And these are all things that would not have been possible without some of that machine learning. And again, that's really exciting because we're always interested in what can we do for players that we couldn't do before. And it's certainly never been possible before that every player owns their own world that has its own history and its own lore and its own gods and its own that's an amazing idea. I mean, so I think some of these technologies, that kind of thing is really interesting, and I think it also just will allow smaller and smaller teams to just make stuff that's cool, right? So I can't draw. I absolutely I'm terrible at visual stuff, but I can code. And so, it may be that AI would allow me to create a game on my own that I wouldn't be able to create without putting a team together. So, those kind of things I think are going to be really exciting for people. Other people can't, a lot of people can't write music. Some people can't code. My co-founder has been using ChatGPT to help him to code games. He's not a coder, he's a designer, but he's been coding games, that one of which, or a couple of which we kind of released publicly. And those things would never have been able to exist without ChatGPT teaching him how to code and generating some of that code. So yeah, I think AI is going to be a really interesting thing, and it's going to be interesting to see how the industry negotiates through that in an ethical way. There's lots of issues around intellectual property, for example, where AIs have gone out and scraped work from artists. I think a lot of those things are going to need to be resolved. And we're certainly trying to always make sure that we're acting in a ethical way and not thinking about the creators and the creative process, and making sure that everybody inside that creative ecosystem is able to get rewarded from it. I think that the danger is that AI can polarize things, and the big tech companies end up owning everything, and the people that used to create everything that these things were trained on are kind of left behind. I think it's important we avoid that.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that with your mission, with your aim and goal, you will create a great impact on the industry, definitely. And I have only last question for you just before we finish our interview. What are some valuable insights or skills you believe aspiring software developers and entrepreneurs should focus on developing nowadays?
So I think start with software developers, I think, so I spent a year just before we founded Magic Cave, or a couple of years before we founded Magic Cave. I wanted to take a year away from kind of commercial side of the game industry, and I lectured teaching people game development, computer science, kind of Unreal Engine development, that kind of thing. And I think what I learned from that, and it's kind of what I've seen throughout the time I've been working in games, and maybe even at school, the people that got really good were the people that often sort of arrived at the course having already made their own games, right? All the tools are out there. You can go online, you can get Unreal Engine, you can get Unity, you can get Godot, you can get all of these amazing technologies. You can get incredible tutorials online, whether for free or just for a few dollars, that will teach you how to do everything. And I think the most valuable thing that I found I was teaching the students is, don't be afraid. Everything is out there for you. Don't expect me to teach you how to do everything. What you need to learn is how to find out how to do everything, and not to be scared of it. But then not just to be told this is how you build a first-person shooter. This is how you build an inventory system. That's kind of useful along the way. But the important thing then, kind of like the Lego set I was talking about, is, okay, this is how you do this, this is how you do this, but now you've got to step back and take it apart and make something that's completely your own. So giving people the confidence to do that, I think, is really important. And you don't necessarily need to go to university to do that. All the tools are there. University can be a really good grounding, but it's all about that practicing coding. And it's a little bit like, somebody could ask me, to tell them how to play the guitar, right? I play around with musical instruments. I'm not very good, but I could show you how to play the guitar, and I could tell you how to play the guitar, but that doesn't mean you can play the guitar. The only way you learn
Yes.
to play the guitar is by practicing. And it's the same with any kind of work thing, I think. You've got to do it. You don't just don't go and do a course and think at the end of the course you're going to be a game designer or a game programmer. You will become a great game designer or game programmer by making games on your own or with other people. So I think that's what I would say to sort of software
Yes.
engineers. And I think for entrepreneurs, I think just do it. Just if you think it's something you want to do, don't talk about it. Just get on and do it. I remember sort of early in my career, everyone would go to the pub after work and complain about work and say, the bosses should do this differently and that differently. But the reality is it's quite difficult starting and running a business, and most people don't want to do it. But you should. I think people should do it, and they should probably do it when they're quite young, because if you wait until you're a bit older and you've got a family or you've got a mortgage to pay, or you've maybe got a job that's paying you pretty well, then you've got stuff to lose. It's much harder to survive on a very low income that you might have when you're starting a business if you've got other people to worry about. So yeah, start a business when you've got nothing to lose. Then what's the worst that can happen? And maybe try to think about that all the time. Always think about what's the worst that can happen. And if the worst that can happen actually is okay, then that's fine, right? If the worst that can happen is, well, I don't have a house to lose, so I can't lose my house. So I wasn't earning a lot of money anyway, or I'm gonna do this project in my own time, while I'm working doing something else that's going to pay the rent. If you really want to do it, you'll find a way. But the more you can do it before, the downside of it failing is bad, then you can go into it being really brave and taking the risks that maybe you do need to take when you're starting a business.
Yep, that's definitely really important. So guys, don't give up, just do it. Forget about your fears and concerns which you are still having of launching a business. Thank you.
Yeah, but I would say, sorry, but I would add one thing, but also be flexible. So don't be so wedded to your idea. It's good to be tenacious and stick with it, but sometimes something isn't working, but it might lead to something else. So, make sure you've a great example would be Slack. So the people behind Slack was built as an internal tool for a game studio that I never saw the game, but I believe the game wasn't particularly good. It certainly wasn't very successful. And what they did, they actually gave away all of their game assets to say to people, just you guys make something you want. We're going to focus on our tool that we've built that we think is pretty good. And that went on to become a multi-billion-dollar tool. And maybe if they'd stuck with their vision of making the game, they would never have had that kind of success.
Yes, it's true. And so thank you for this advice, tips and tricks. We can say it was a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for sharing just your knowledge with us and our listeners.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for your time.